Well, good morning, everyone. Checking 1, 2. Hopefully you guys can hear me. If anybody is in the chat room, go ahead and say hi. Howdy, howdy. Make sure everything's going right here. Hopefully you have your beverage of choice, as I do this morning. Another beautiful day here it's very sunny today, so the camera's going to take a quick second or two to change, but very, very sunny day here in South Dakota. All the snow is now gone, and it should actually start warming up past 40 degrees today. Hopefully everybody can see me and hear me. For those that are here, welcome. And those that are yet to join us as we start our journey in the new series called Daylight. Instead of Nightlight on Fridays, it's now Daylight, early mornings here on Fridays. And the topic that Dr. Howard and I looked at, was going through a journey with you guys in church history. And we're going to be looking today at why we do this journey through church history, how it informs other areas of our studies of the scriptures, as well as our just understanding of where we are today. I'm looking forward to this, as I have been. Very rarely do churches teach church history. I don't know if it is a lack of knowledge or understanding about church history, or just that they think people are going to have a snooze fest when it comes time to actually teach church history. Growing up, I loved history. I liked history class in high school. Growing up, I did a lot with my grandfather, who was a Civil War buff. And so I got to learn a lot about the Civil War period. In fact, we got to spend 2 weeks in Virginia and traveled all about the southern states, looking at different Civil War battle sites. So this area was already of interest to me. And then as I become a Christian, realizing that there's a rich history of faith that goes well before we ever existed. And to ignore that, as more modern churches do, to just kind of say, yes, that was the past, but we're different. Not so much. Also, we must be able to look at the past, as the famous phrase goes, to prepare ourselves so that we do not fall into the same traps or the same problems as the church in the past did. Hopefully everybody can get in and interact with it. Nothing's looking bad on my end, but you never know. Dr. Howard and I have had our fair share of technical difficulties this week. Hopefully you have your pad and paper and highlighters ready. I will be putting some documents in the group on the side where it says group documents, as far as a reading list for different books on church history, as well as an audio playlist and some different web resources if you want to dive in a little bit further. But with that, let us get going. So this particular session on church history is going to go from the church fathers, starting with Polycarp, Irenaeus, those in the first century, to just after the Reformation. I don't see a point in trying to go down the rabbit hole of the beginning of modern denominationalism. That's a study in and of itself. Most church history classes separate the two eras. So they usually go Acts to pre-Reformation, and then there will be a second class, History 201, that goes from the Reformation to sometimes they'll go modern times, or sometimes they will stop in the right about the time of the origins of religion in this country. So they'll take a 200-year period from 1516 to let's say 1800. Very few history books are chronicling the developments in the modern era, especially with the mass advent of so many different denominations and the splits. It would be nearly impossible to write said history while maintaining perspective and being able to accurately transcribe what has gone on. I know when I was in the Southern Baptist Convention, there was a lady from the headquarters office that was in contact with all the churches, trying to get historical documents, when they were founded, who have been the pastors, etc., to try and create a more modern history. And yet even with all this technology, it's still very difficult doing modern history. And for those that are doing it, good on you. In fact, there's a gentleman, he should be about done with his doctoral thesis at Talbot on the expansion, growth, and history of the Black Hebrew Israelite movement. And I really want to get a hold of that thesis. I might have to get a hold of some people. But that's more modern, the last 120 years of that particular movement. And so it's very difficult with all the splinters and the offshoots. But from what I've heard, he's done a very good job at doing that. So we're just going to be covering the early church fathers period to just post the Reformation. I'm looking at approximately 75 presentations, 30-minute discussions with you guys, lessons. So strap in. It looks like we're on a journey for about a year if we get one lesson a week in. So let's dive in. Big question is, why study church history? This is asked by a lot of people. I've offered in the past to teach church history at the churches in which I pastored, and there just seems to be this, church history, why? And yet, I don't know why there's this negativity towards church history. Whether it's been presented in a way in which people are unwilling or not wanting to partake. Well, that's funny, guys. You guys are commenting on the live feed, but on my live feed, I'm not getting any of it. So if it takes me a minute to get to your comments, I'm sorry. Thanks, Tab. Yep, today is Christy and I's 16th wedding anniversary. Man, does 16 years go fast. But every day is a new adventure with Christy and the girls, and I love them to death. Yes, Dr. Howard, it is laziness. It is the laziness of people, and I don't know why your comments aren't showing up on what's called the Facebook Live producer, so I'm sorry about that. It is laziness, because unless we study church history, we don't really see, as Dr. Howard's been teaching on Wednesdays and Thursdays, as we've been looking at hermeneutics and somewhat of the history of how we interpret our Bibles, as we've been looking at these different systems, whether it's covenant theology, dispensational theology, amillennialism, postmillennialism, they all have roots in history. And unless we understand where they've come from, we don't know how to prevent ourselves falling in those similar traps. So what is church history? It's hopefully looking at the past in an objective way, not putting ourselves in the past, kind of like we do often with the Bible. Everybody loves to insert themselves into the Bible, just as we like to insert ourselves in history. Church history, hopefully, is an honest look at the people, places, and events of the past and how it's shaped where we are today. For many, church history is often just a preamble or make work until you get to the quote-unquote heroes of the Reformation. I remember that was the case when I took church history in seminary, both in my undergraduate and graduate degrees. They make you get through them, and the whole point, everybody in the class is like, oh, well, what about Wittenberg, and what about the thesis, and what about, and it's just like, no, we've got 1,500 years of church history before we even get to the Reformation period. And so the students often just hurry up and try and get through all this material and push the professor to get through to Wycliffe, Huss, Luther, Calvin, and other either pre-reformers or reformers. And it's like, wait, you missed the whole reason for their protest, their reformation of the church, their being Protestant, because you missed the introduction of Arianism in the 3rd century. You missed the introduction of allegorical interpretation in the 5th century. And then you got all these different building blocks leading up to the need for a Reformation in the 1500s. Wycliffe was very clear to point out the history. Most of his actual printed work, if it's still available today, was on the development of theology within the Roman Catholic Church and how they'd gotten to that point. So many people forget that Wycliffe and others were doctors in the church. They had advanced degrees in theology and in... My computer is going crazy. Sorry, folks. Just one moment. There we go. We're back. Hopefully the stream didn't end. Unfortunately, this is the case in church history. It's just make work. It's just hurry up and let's slog it through so that we can go rah, 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 go Reformation. It's like there's so much more to be gleaned, especially from the early martyrs of the church and the early church fathers and their work that set up a lot of our apologetic and a lot of our systematic theology was in that formational time, the first 3.5 centuries of the church. In Romans 15:4, we're reminded that whatever was written in the former days was written for our instruction. Now this specifically Paul is writing of the Old Testament, of the Torah, that it was written for our instruction so that we might understand where now the new covenant and the new testament come into play. But also we must take the same attitude when looking at church history, that these things are written down so that we can learn from them. That God in his providence and in his foreknowledge has allowed us to be able to write down and to put down our history so that we can learn from it. That through endurance and encouragement of the scriptures we might have hope. That throughout this we are going to be looking at relevant scriptural passages and what people were dealing with in their centuries. When we get to Arius and Council of Nicaea in 325, we're going to be looking at the doctrine of the Trinity, how it was understood in their time versus how it is understood today. In many ways, this is going to be a great parallel resource for those of you going through the systematic theology class on Mondays, as well as the hermeneutics class on, I believe it's Wednesday or Thursday with Dr. Howard. I hear you, Norman. Yeah, I will take our time. We got at least 75 lessons, and some of them might get divvied up into a couple sessions each. So it's okay. I like taking time in church history. It is fun. What I consider fun, at least. Another thing that we should notice when studying church history is that we stand on the shoulders of giants. Men and women of the faith that have either been martyred, given their testimony, martyrion, as we looked at in our study of Revelation this week, for the faith. That is only in and through their sacrifices and their willingness to keep the faith despite persecution, despite the overwhelming onlook of death, that we stand upon their great works and have gotten to where we are today. That God has continued to build his church, and he has used great men and women of the past in order to do it. Hindsight's always 20/20, as I say, so we should evaluate history without prejudice, and we should avoid projecting our understanding onto it or them. What I mean by this is so often we love to, even I get in the trap of going, Origen, he came up with that allegorical interpretation, and so just bah humbug. And yet really that's not what I've tried to do, is evaluating them given their time and given the light in which they had. We have to realize, especially in the first 3.5 centuries, we're dealing with a persecuted church. Because they're meeting in secret, they don't have the time or the resources to sit and write a systematic theology or to write long treatises on different theological topics. No, they were just living to survive and spreading the gospel. And so we see a great influx once Christianity becomes tolerated in the early part of the 4th century. We see an expansion of their ability to write theology, to deal in apologetics without the threat of death looming over their heads. And yet we have to take that for its face value. We have to take the fact that they didn't write these huge volumes. Like over here, I've got Berkhof's Systematic Theology. This, and oftentimes this is the condensed version, but Berkhof's Systematic Theology is usually 2 volumes this size. Or Schaff's, which is like 5 or 6 volumes, or many of the other systematic theologies in which take an entire lifetime to compile and to print. The early church didn't have that. So we must show a lot of grace when it comes to dealing with history and those that are in it. I know, Howard. I know, Dr. Howard. Origen, humbug. I know, trust me. And you know what? That's okay. As long as we are able to explain why we have a negative view of a certain person in church history according to their theology, according to their apologetic, then we can rightfully examine them. But I think a lot of grace needs to be given because hindsight's 20/20. We also must avoid anachronism. Anachronism is projecting the way we understand things or our current situation. Like right now I'm seeing cars drive by on the highway. I can't say that David had access to a car. It's only up until modern history, post-Reformation, in which up until just after the Reformation, most people didn't go more than 7 miles from their homes. So your life was contained within a 7-mile radius. Very few people, especially people of lesser means, were able to get out and to see the world, so to speak, unlike we have the great blessing to. And so because things have seemed as though they were always the same, that's why you see a lot of the Renaissance and Reformation era paintings of biblical characters wearing armor, Roman armor, or wearing modern, to their time, clothing, because things have always been the same. things have never really changed because they weren't able to get out and to see the world. You lived and died within a 7-mile radius of where you were born for the majority of people in Europe. And so we have to realize that this anachronism for most people in those periods looking back on Old Testament history, that they imported their anachronisms and understanding of life into the text of the scriptures. And so that's why we see a lot of interesting commentary and application of scripture because of their anachronisms. So I'm going to try as best as I can to avoid that ourselves. And seeing how it's been done in the past, it gives me the opportunity to take just a couple of steps back and go, okay, we're not going to go down that route. We need to honestly evaluate when they lived, what information they had, what were some of the outside influences, what was the persecution like, what apologetic battles were they dealing in that culture. Tradition is often formed in the skewed view of church history. In other words, today many people have traditions. And to quote the musical Traditions, everybody has them, whether you know it or not. And the danger is the most dangerous type of people say that they have no traditions. We have traditions, whether it's family traditions, church traditions, theological traditions, in which some people will, go and die on that hill to defend those traditions, and yet it often skews their view of church history. The seminary I went to, one of the classes for history was Baptist history. And a part of the curriculum was a little book called The Trail of Blood. Some of you are probably familiar with the little booklet, or it's now a little bit bigger volume, in which tries to present almost an apostolic succession for Baptist churches, going all the way back to Peter and Paul. And yet it's often formed in tradition, and looking at it in the light of church history, there's a lot of anachronisms, and there's a lot of unproven assertions within that little booklet, but it's taken as, for many independent fundamentalist Baptists, IFCA churches, and that it's like the go-to text when it comes to church history, because it shows this tradition of coming all the way from the early church fathers to today. And yet it paints a negative picture towards the reformers. And yes, the reformers weren't all great, wonderful people. We're going to look at that once we get into the pre and post-Reformation period. But tradition is often skewed in the view of church history. In fact, I was just listening to Dr. White's series on church history again. This is like the 4th or 5th time I've listened through it now. Define tradition, Dr. Howard is asking. Tradition is the set of rules, the ordinary occurrences, the continuation of things from the past. As I have often defined tradition lately, and I don't know who this comes from, so I'm sorry, is tradition is nothing more than peer pressure by dead men. And it's true. Most of the traditions that we have today are taken as tradition, and we have to do it. Why? Because that's how they did it X, Y, and Z then, or this is the way that we've always done it. And often that puts a skew on, well, why? Well, you can't ask why because it's tradition. Why? And because people are unable to ask those why or how questions, then when they look back at something like church history, then they see what they want to see in church history, just like in that book, The Trail of Blood, that they want to paint the Protestantism as a separate movement from Baptists, and that all the reformers were nasty and ugly, and we've got this great tradition of basically pre-mill, pre-tribulational rapture, Baptist distinctives all the way from the apostles. And it's like, seriously, people? And in fact, listening back to Dr. White's presentation on church history, he did this in about 70 sessions, and there's no way I could do it in 70 sessions. I don't know how he did it. Dave Hunt, in a conversation to Dr. White, in their discussion of tradition and its influence on the church, Dave Hunt said to Dr. White, "I have no traditions." That's probably one of the most dangerous things a person can say, because you're unwilling or unwanting to see your own traditions. And the context was in talking about theology and how Dave Hunt's presentation, I think the topic was Dave Hunt's book, The Woman Who Rides the Beast, and how Dr. White was pointing out a lot of traditions that have been passed on and are continued in the book. And Dave Hunt said, "I have no traditions." Well, you might want to think about that. And many people become slaves to the tradition. Many of you are in the Southern Baptist Convention. I was in the Southern Baptist Convention for 6 years. Right now, the Southern Baptist Convention is going through nothing but a fight of tradition on one sense, and then a radical departure from the said tradition on the other hand. You've got the tradition of, we must fight Calvinism and any strain of Protestantism as much as we can to maintain our Baptist traditions. And then on the other hand, you have the Southern Baptist Convention adopting and endorsing people like Stephen Furtick and who's the lady, quote unquote, preacher who's been giving them a hard time? Not Paula White, the other one. Name will come to me. Yeah, you're right, Dr. Howard. We've never done it this way before. Oh. There's nothing new under the sun, folks. Ecclesiastes is abundantly clear on that fact. It's just wrapped differently. There's nothing new. And yet mankind often becomes slaves to tradition. In fact, when I first got here to South Dakota, where I am at is heavily Lutheran and Roman Catholic territory, hardcore. And so when some of the folks from the Lutheran church started coming and attending the church here, they're like, well, what about this part of the service? And what about that part of the service? And all it had to do was with tradition. We've always done these things. But a lot of the times, I don't think that they ever asked why. Why do we do them? Why does the pastor or the priest absolves people's sins in the middle of the service? Or why is communion reverenced so much and put into a box or a cibellum or a pict or whatever method that they use? Many of these traditions they become slaves to. And then when you start to open the scriptures and what saith the scriptures to them, they start going, you mean everything that I've done for 40 years is tradition? Yeah. And it's a freeing and amazing to see God opening people's eyes to the traditions of either their theology or the traditions of the church. And I am somewhat of a rebel, so to speak. in that if we don't see an example in Scripture for said tradition, the only traditions I have, quote unquote, are baptism and communion. That's about it. And I could say not only are they traditions, but they're commandments, and they are the ordinances of the church. Around here, there's a lot of talk of sacralism and the sacraments of the church. We'll get into that as it develops in church history. In Matthew 16:18, Jesus says, I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. We need to realize when looking at church history is that Jesus is continually building his church. He has been building his church for the last 2 millennia. And to deny that fact and to think it is just the men and the women contained in church history is rather myopic at best. That we should look at the fact that Jesus is using purposely certain men and women of the faith at certain times to build his church. And then at no point, unlike our Mormon friends, say that the church disappeared at some point and the gospel was not on the earth. No, because the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Now, there is a misnomer and a misunderstanding due to the language and the translation. It's not that the gates of hell are prevailing or in attack against the church. It's actually the other way around. Is the church going to and attacking the very strongholds and the gates of hell? To, as Jude puts it, pulling those as though they were singed by fire, pulling them out of the fire. The church should be close to the gates of hell and waging war on that ground, our chosen field of battle. And Jesus says, I will build my church, and the works of the enemy and the battleground is a place in which we will prevail. Why? Because Jesus already has prevailed. He has already won. So we need to keep this in the back of our mind when we're looking at church history, is that God is using events and place and people in space and in time to build his church. Why he chooses to do so, I have no clue. It's one of those questions when we get to heaven. Why? I'm going to be like a 5-year-old when I get to heaven. Why? Why? And yet, we will get some answers then. But until then, I'm still going to ask the question, why? And in fact, Jude chapter 1, verse 3, we read that we should contend for the faith that was once and for all delivered to the saints. There's no post-New Testament, there's no additions to the faith. So yes, there are great works and apologetics presented by men and women throughout church history, but they don't replace the scripture. The faith is given to the saints once and for all. We have that in 66 books by 40 authors over thousands of years. We can clearly see what the gospel is, the plan of salvation is, and what the church is and should do in the text of Scripture. So we continue to contend for that faith and to give an apologia of that faith, but there is no adding to it. Many of the traditions of man want to try and add to the work of the church. Man, 36 minutes has gone by already. This just means it's too much fun. We're also going to be looking at ecclesiology. One of the big areas of theology that gets skewed, misunderstood, misapplied, is ecclesiology, the theology behind what is the church and how should it function. Church history shows that very early on in the church's history, the church got off on their ecclesiology. We start seeing positions that are unbiblical. We start seeing authority and power being given where it is not given in Scripture. We see a proverbial left turn at Albuquerque, starting once the age of persecution ends, right in the middle of the 3rd century. There were events leading up to it, and we're going to look at that. I don't want to give away too much of our fun later. But ecclesiology is looking at the form, function, and purpose of the church. Dr. Howard, in his teaching in 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, clearly lays out the form, function, and purpose of the church. And yet, we have to realize, how did we get to where we are today? How did the form, function, and purpose of the church get skewed? And how is it that the churches today have kept the proper traditions or the proper rules of the church today? This is one of the things, as I mentioned, I'm fighting here in rural South Dakota. Because we've always done things a certain way, and because the church has always had a certain form or function, then there's resistance when the Word pushes us to reform that understanding, to mold and change our minds, and to move our paths in a direction that the Word wants us to go, rather than tradition. That word's going to come up a lot. In fact, very early on in the church was a phrase that is continued in Latin, even till today in the Roman Catholic traditions. Extra ecclesiam nulla solus. Outside the church, there's no salvation. When understood correctly in the realm of Scripture, that yes, outside of the invisible church, those that call Christ Lord, there is no salvation. There's no salvation in any other. But what happens very early on, we see, is that this statement is misunderstood and misapplied, and tradition gets surrounded by it, and then creates the two distinct categories of sola scriptura and sola ecclesia. Either the Word and the Word alone, or the church and the church alone. This schism, shall we say, starts very early in the church. And so I want this to be a precursor to when we start looking at the early apologetic of the church and the early initiation of doctrine, shall we say, in the church, and how it leads to this schism between sola scriptura and sola ecclesia. Early church schisms were due to this view. The nature and the role of priests or pastors within the churches, whether they have the right or the authority to do certain things within the church. And we have continual schisms to this day between the Roman Catholic Church and those that would call themselves Protestant, those that protest against the church in Rome. We see this being the primary mode of contention. If you were to watch any debate between Christians, Protestants, and Roman Catholics, the primary difference is in this, whether it's the sole authority of the church and the Pope, or if it's the sole authority of the Scriptures. So how do we identify the church? This is super important when going into the early centuries of the church and defining what it is and it is not. Dr. Howard's been doing a great series in 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, and giving us the scriptural tools on how to define it. But in larger umbrella terms, we can see the visible local church as professing believers. This is when we identify the church, the ecclesia in the New Testament. This is the 9 times out of 10, the context by which it is speaking. That the visible local ecclesia is those that are gathered to worship God, who profess His name, who actually believe. Then there's the invisible church, what we call the kingdom now. The saints that have come to Christ over all of human history, that are a part of this invisible church, that are a part of God's kingdom now, and yet part of his kingdom is not yet. The kingdom now is that we get to join in this family of God and get to profess Christ, and that we have a lineage of people before us that have professed the name of Christ, as we're going to look at each of them and their apologetics and their professions of faith. Some questions about this visible and invisible churches is put. How much theology is needed to be a part of the groups above? This is a vital question when starting to look at the church in the first, let's say, 5 centuries. How much knowledge does a Christian need in order to be a true believing Christian? Does it matter whether they can read or not? Does it matter whether or not the doctrines of grace, or they've read extreme treatises on the process of salvation or systematic theology in order for them to come to faith? How much theology are we going to, once again, being afraid of it imparting what we know today to those in those early centuries, and judging them based upon our knowledge rather than understanding what it is that they had at that time? These are also questions that many evangelists and missionaries have to ask themselves when going into a new land or a new place in which the gospel either has not been preached or very seldomly preached. How much theology is needed to be a part of the visible church? And can grace be given for missteps or misspeaking in statements given for apologetic or cultural issues? We see many early church fathers being just absolutely torn to shreds according to our current understanding of systematic theology, of the process of salvation, of the content of Scripture. Many, we would probably hang today. And in the reverse, if I was alive in, let's say, Geneva during the time of Calvin, I'm sure I would be getting my third baptism. So, for those of you who don't know, the third baptism, it was often a punishment for the radical Reformation, the Anabaptists, that as they were baptized again, baptism, that their punishment was often to be weighted down or to be held down underwater and drowned to death. In fact, very near the Castle Church in Wittenberg, there's a bridge with a creek or a stream, and many Anabaptists got their third baptism in that creek by Martin Luther. You ever think about that one? So, can grace be given for missteps for people? I mean, I know certainly that Calvin and Luther and others are going to be held accountable for the lives that were taken for the cause of religion. But there are other less hideous things than giving third baptisms. That can we show grace to those that have gone before us and have had to deal with things that we haven't? And that question is going to be asked quite a few times in this journey. Then we need to look at what I call the institutional church. These are the baptized, card-carrying members of such and such church. This is by the time Martin Luther, and John Calvin come around, it's a government church. The tax rolls of the state are the baptism rolls of the church. And that the main reason that some of the reformers kept paedobaptism was because not that they misunderstood baptism, although many did, is that in light of the Scriptures, even when presented with it, I'm thinking of Calvin being presented with evidence for believers' baptism, but he wanted to accept it, but the doctrine of the church was controlled by the state. He had a debate with some of his students in front of the council, but the council would not change the doctrine of the church because it was the tax rolls of the state. So what we see as the official church state, where you cannot separate politics and religion, becomes an enemy of the Bible and an enemy of the truth during those times. But we have to realize that Calvin was in that situation, even though he's the people's pastor. In very many ways, Luther was also in that challenge of the church, the government-run church. Or today, we have cultural churches, the country club churches. We have the traditional church because we've always done it. I can think of 2, 3 right here in town that are, we've always done it this way. And there's very little Bible and there's very little questions. It's all, Jesus is wonderful, and let's not talk about sin. Let's not talk about salvation. Then there's the CEO Christian church. You only see most of the quote-unquote congregation on Christmas, Easter, and other holidays. We see that this tradition of the institutional church in its various forms continues with us till this day. That John Q. Public, if he says, I belong to such and such Baptist church and I was baptized there by so-and-so, that's their supposed ticket in heaven. Or for many during church history, especially post-Reformation, we will see that it is, I was baptized as an infant at the local church, and that's, my ticket to heaven. In fact, a quote-unquote woman pastor here in town, the last 3 funerals, I get reports back from some of my congregation that she's claiming that so-and-so is in heaven because they were baptized at that church as an infant, and yet they lived their life as an absolute heathen the rest of their life. And yet, oh no, I'm sure they're in heaven today because on this day in 19 whatever, so-and-so was baptized right here at this baptismal fount. And, God looks for the baptism. God holds them by the baptism. Oh boy. Sorry, I get a little heated when it comes to baptism and communion because they are ordinances of the church, and when people have misunderstood and misapplied them, I get a little heated, as we shall see. What is some of the benefits of knowing church history? How does this make any difference in our lives? Why is it something that we should put time and effort and enjoyment into? It helps to avoid every wind of doctrine. In realizing that according to Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. Every strange, weird doctrine, every cult that has come up has their roots in history. And if we know some of their roots, if we know of Arianism and we know of Gnosticism, and then we know of streams of philosophy early in the first century, we can then clearly see where we get something like the Mormon Church today, or where we get secret societies such as the Masonic Lodge. We can easily see their roots and their history, and it gives us opportunity then to be able to defend against those heresies or just those plain out false teachings because we know history, because we know where they come from. Gagging there, Mrs. H? We also get a better understanding of quote-unquote fads. Fads are nothing new, and we must understand where they're deriving their supposed doctrinal stance on these things. I'm thinking of, especially right now, the big thing is worship. The battle of worship, of whether it's the hymns or contemporary worship. Hillsong, etc., where even in history's past, there have been compromises in theology and in the church based upon songs. In fact, we're going to see very quickly that, according to tradition, Arius was an accomplished musician and a songwriter, and he propagated his teachings using music. Hey, isn't that the same thing Hillsong's doing? Yeah. It's all about me. It's all about me. It's about what I feel. Oh no, that doctrine stuff. No, it's about what I feel. It's about my feelings, about my feelings, about my feelings. Sorry, I get sarcastic. Or something like the prayer of Jabez. That kind of stuff gives me headaches. The very fact that the church could not see a underwhelming misapplication of Scripture, that this prayer is then pulled out and then prayed by everybody, and then there's a prayer of Jabez coffee cup and a prayer of Jabez mug and this and that and the yeah, I know it. It's we have to realize that there's nothing new, that this has happened in the history of the church in the past, and how we can guard against it today. Or the 40 days of purpose that made, what's his name, a boatload of money, that was used as an evangelism tool. I'm here. Just sometimes when I bring this, as Dr. Howard says, stupid. Yeah. But it just goes to show these fads that come up every few years. Well, now 40 Days of Purpose is like what, at least 20 years old? But there's nothing new under the sun. The same thing has happened in the past, and the church has been often unprepared or unwilling to deal with it and call it for what it is. Except for I know Dr. Howard's been very consistent on this. Church history connects Acts, history, systematic theology, and apologetics. And I would say to a large extent eschatology as well. I think in studying church history will help underline or undergird everything that Dr. Howard's been teaching during the week. That as we look at 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John and John's apologetic to the Gnostics, when we look at 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, the focus of the church, all of these are issues that are dealt with in church history. And that I believe that the two are a tapestry, as it's been often described, an interwoven tapestry that you shouldn't separate the two. We can look at the two and how they interact just because the way our brains work, but ultimately in the fabric of time and space, they're married. They're joined at the hip. And so it's been, I think, a very negative, a very detrimental situation when the church doesn't want to look at church history, thinks of it negatively. I mean, I know a lot of the people I went to when I took this course at Hope International University in Southern California. A lot of them were just like, oh, let's get this class done. I need this one and the next one, and then I'm done with church history. It's like, wait a second. No, that's not the attitude that we should have towards church history, because we are a part of that history. We are currently writing our own history and the things that we're dealing with in our day, such as Islam, Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, etc., in which, if the Lord tarries, a future generation will look back and see what we have dealt with and maybe are encouraged and are asking the questions, well, why did they take this stand or that stand, or why is that they dealt with this apologetic, or why is it that they were looking into this realm of theology at that time? Hopefully. With that, this is the end of our first session on church history. I didn't realize that I was going to be going an hour. I thought I was going to limit this to a half hour for today, but it's the first session. Just like a study in Revelation, it went quite a bit longer than expected, but that's okay. I'm really looking forward to this with everyone on Friday mornings and nightlight or daylight. It's very daylight out right now. And looking forward to helping to connect these things. Church history, apologetics, systematic theology, ecclesiology, basically all of the ologies are tied into how did we get here. With that, I pray that you guys be blessed, that you have a great day. I'm really looking forward to this, and still very thankful. Really enjoyed the last two classes with Dr. Howard on Wednesday and Thursday, especially in looking at the differences in millennial perspectives. And it just, me hollering here in South Dakota about how we got there, and realizing that this wasn't just an overnight evolution of theology, that this took hundreds, even potentially over 1,000 years to come up with said theologies. And yet, once again, tradition comes in, and if you're a reformer, then you're bound by tradition to be either postmillennial or amillennial. Wait a second, whoever said that? Did any of the early church fathers believe that? Oh no, we can't look at the early church fathers because we know more than the early church fathers. Not a problem, Mrs. H and Dr. Howard. I'm glad to be able to do this and to be with you guys. You guys have a blessed day. I'm going to get the bulletins and stuff done here for service on Sunday, and then go home and spend some time with my girls, especially on this anniversary day. Well, you guys be blessed. May God bless you and keep you. May He make His face shine upon you and give you peace this week. Bye, y'all.